would Tolkien say that films have destroyed true subcreation?
Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
Welcome, my friends, my countrymen, as we move on into the pursuit of life, liberty, and the I messed that up. Into life, liberty, and the pursuit of fantasy. That's what we're doing today. Thanks everybody for joining us. We're into is this part 4? I think it's part 4 of the essay on fairy stories that Tolkien wrote and revised a couple times, or at least once over his lifetime. And today we're on fantasy. What is fantasy? And from that, we also look at what is imagination, what is enchantment, what would Tolkien say about films, and how have they destroyed fantasy? It kind of seems maybe that way we're going to talk about that. Before we do, of course, we have our usual. So skip ahead about a minute, all you people who hear this every single week, because we've got our extended membership podcast that's coming up later, and we're going to talk about more about like what would Tolkien think of the films, because obviously Christopher Tolkien was dead set against the movies that Peter Jackson made, but Tolkien is kind of dead set against drama as a vehicle for fantasy. So what would he say about his films in particular? We're going to go into that. We got a great quote from Robert Frost that Sigüenza sent us that we're going to talk about. In addition to, I can't even read this question because it's really going to mess me up later. Anyway, they're really good questions, and you should listen by becoming a member at theonering.com/member for $4 a month. So
we do,
okay,
in fact, have the best. We have the best fans.
We do, we do, and we have the best questions too. We got 3 good ones. So yeah, thanks for joining us, all of you people who skipped ahead 60 seconds. Nice to have you back.
Welcome back.
We are into section 4, fantasy, of Tolkien's essay, and instead of Dan's big thought, I think we have to go into Michael's massive mind.
Oh, no.
This is one
Michael's
of those,
massive monologue, maybe.
Mindful monologue. We talked a lot before recording tonight, because it's a short part of his essay, but there's a lot of meat on these bones here.
Yeah.
And Michael, who has spent a lot more time spending with, I mean, gosh, didn't you just go over it with your kids too, who read it in school,
Yes.
and looked at it?
My
Yeah.
high school,
And so, yeah. So there's a lot to go over, but I think what we do is we start right at the beginning. We start with imagination and how he defines imagination, as opposed to fantasy.
Right.
And so I'll read that first quote, and then let's start talking about it. This is in the very first paragraph. It's the third sentence. Fourth sentence. Third sentence, second comma. Imagination has often been held to be something higher than the mere image making ascribed to the operations of fancy, a reduced and depreciatory form of the older word fantasy. An attempt is thus made to restrict, I should say misapply, imagination to the power of giving to ideal creations the inner consistency of reality. So he wants us to move away from the idea that imagination and fantasy are the same thing. Yeah. Is there more to be said about imagination versus fantasy here? Because he kind of pushes it off to the side pretty quick.
Well, he pushes what he does is he actually relegates imagination. He's very philosophic. He says imagination is not, and I would give an example just to prove his point. So his point is imagination is just the power of image making. That's what imagination is. Very Aristotelian about that. I would point out that it's not the common definition that he set up that you just read, Jonathan. As he says it's not this.
Right.
Imagination is not the power of giving to ideal creations the inner consistency of reality. There's more to doing that than just imagination, because we use our imagination to do all kinds of things. When my wife tells me that she needs me to go to Costco, I imagine what the trip to Costco was like, but I do not build a miniature Costco in my head and fill it with all the things that I don't create a reality. I just have a list of items I'm supposed to get from Costco. And so my imagination is at work creating images in my head of the things that I need to get, but it doesn't have the inner consistency of reality. It's just images that are kind of mental notes of a kind. So imagination is a faculty. It's just a power of our mind. so what is this other thing? So what is fantasy is the real question. And that's what he spends the first couple pages dealing with, is what's this thing, fantasy? And he lands, I think, on the fact that he says, if it's not imagination that gives that inner consistency, then the achievement of the expression which gives or seems to give, quote, the inner, well, this is his quote within a quote, the inner consistency of reality is indeed another thing or aspect, and it needing another name. Art, this is capital A art, the operative link between imagination and the final result, subcreation. So you got the train, you have imagination, and then you have this art, and then you have the final product, which is subcreation. And so it's the art that he's going to be most concerned with, and that this craft. And later on in this part of the essay, he goes into this very unusual digression, a related digression about the Faërian drama, capital F, Faërian drama. And we're going to talk about that, but I think that's a distraction right now. Right now, he's just talking about what is it? What is this art? What does it have and not have? That this fantasy that's created, what does it have and not have in advantage and disadvantages versus other narrative arts or other human arts that produce a kind of subcreation at the end? And I think the first thing he says is it has an advantage. This fantasy, this art that creates the subcreation, this fantasy has an advantage. The advantage, he says, is, quote, arresting strangeness. So that's the advantage it has. In other words, it has a kind of wondrous character, something which he called magic, which he's now going to disavow in this section, but he referred to it earlier in his essay as magic. But it has this character that draws the mind in and grabs you as an arresting strangeness. But that strangeness, that advantage, because it grabs the mind, fantasy grabs the mind, comes with a disadvantage. Let me give you an example before I go into the disadvantage. Andúril, the sword of Aragorn. The fact that 3 or 4 times in Lord of the Rings, it actually appears to ignite, it catches on fire, it flashes or flames, he uses the word flames, arrests the mind of my children, especially my young sons who listen to it for the first time. They latch on to that element. So the idea of a flaming sword is a wondrous thing. But now we get to the disadvantage of fantasy. So fantasy can grab the mind with its arresting strangeness, but now it has a disadvantage. And that is the arresting strangeness itself makes it difficult for the mind to be convinced, and even in a secondary way, that this is real. It is difficult for there to be, quote, the inner consistency of reality with fantasy. It's harder than, for example, a crime drama. So if someone writes a piece of fiction that's a crime drama, and they write it in the modern age, the fact that so many of the elements of the story of the crime drama are in the world around us gives it an advantage. It's easier to believe that crime drama than it is Rings, because of the strangeness of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I think this is for the part of the essay where he talks about the green sun, right? It's fantastical. It's fantasy to imagine your head what a green sun would look like and what living in a world with a green sun would be like. But he says that's the first step, imagining, but then trying to produce something using art to convey that in a way where it makes sense that I live in a world with a green sun. That's what he's saying is the higher plane of what subcreation is.
Exactly. That, Dan, is the inner consistency of reality, which is tough to reach. The idea of a green sun's really cool. We start instantly thinking about it, but then to create that, as you said, to create that world which makes the green sun believable, that's a lot harder to do. Yeah. And it makes and which I would say is the reason why we have so much crap into the fantasy genre, because so many times when people have a fantastical idea and they try to convey it, they do so poorly because it's a hard thing. That craft is hard. There are some crafts that are more difficult than others, and I think Tolkien would say that this is one of the most difficult.
He gives it the word elvish craft, meaning it's not even, it's beyond the scope of what a normal human can do, right? And the elves were able to make
Right.
the Silmarils and these great, wondrous pieces of art, which humans could only aspire to, or dwarves. But to do this aspirational form of art, fantasy, is a special kind of elvish craft. I don't know if you'd give it that like. There's nothing harder than that. I think you would say.
I do think so. I do think he said it's very difficult. And here's the direct quote: "Fantasy may be, as I think, not less but more sub-creative. But in any rate, it is found in practice that the inner consistency of reality is more difficult to produce. The more unlike are the images and rearrangements of primary material to the actual arrangements of the primary world. So the fact that real swords don't flame and real orcs don't exist makes the story more interesting on its face, but then more difficult to carry off successfully as sub-creative. Now, I would argue that Tolkien does in fact succeed nevertheless, despite the arresting strangeness of his world. But it's a long haul to do that with a world as arrestingly strange as Middle-earth is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Tolkien, he's kind of pushing back on people that maybe criticize fantasy, because he talks about how people would probably confuse it or confound it with like dreams or mental disorders. I think he even gets into that, where
Yes.
you're picture a green sun, great, you're mentally ill, just but to him it was like the crafting of a tale where that green sun actually makes sense. I think his direct quote in here is, he says, according to him, fantasy is not a lower form of art, but a higher form of art. And he says,
Exactly.
indeed, it's the most nearly pure form, and so when achieved, the most potent. And I think that that's a really interesting quote to me. That, like I can imagine, like, very easily coming up with like a crime story, and coming up with like a gumshoe detective and all these different characters that populate this world that's very close to what our world is in reality. But for Tolkien, it's like, that's too easy. Like, if you want to get really artistic, I'm going to give you like something really hard. Imagine, a green sun. Go with that. Make that happen. And like, to him, it's like the level of craft that it would take, to make that work. He's saying that that takes real skill, according to him.
Right.
Let me ask a question then about his use of the word art, because it's been co-opted for what I think is a lot of non-artistic things, like duct taping a banana to a wall. So when he says it's, like you just read that, Dan, fantasy is, I think, not a lower but a higher form of art with a capital A.
Yeah.
What is he saying with that word art right now? Because it's not painting, it's not drawing. Art is what here? Because that's a very foundational word that he's using. Go ahead, Michael.
Well, it's a kind of making, it's a kind of craft, right? So, and it is a mental and vocal craft, or at least literary craft. So, in other words, he's connecting this particular art. I don't think he's going into what art is as a whole, although I think he would be happy to do so if you were to ask him. But in this case, he's very specific, talking about the kind of art that is narrative in structure. It's a craft that is narrative in structure, and it presents a world or a story to the viewer and to the listener, to the reader, that has that inner consistency of reality. And so that craft of creating that inner consistency, of matching, of describing, of making, of showing forth a world that achieves that inner consistency of reality is key to what an art is in this case.
He writes, I was just kind of going through my highlights here, and he writes, indeed, in the paragraph right above it, and I think we already read this, where he gives it another name, right? Needing another name. Art. The art is the operative link between imagination and subcreation. Right? That's his definition right there.
Right, but in what does that consist? So, because we talked about that, we said imagination was the ability to make images, and subcreation is the final product, where when you've succeeded.
Right, and it takes artistry, art, craft in order to get there. That's his definition.
So what another way maybe of putting it is that to the artist of fantasy, to the fantasy artist, this art is like the paintbrushes and the paint to a visual artist. It's the thing that they use to create the final, the Monet is the end product. That's the subcreation in the Tolkien parallel, the final Monet painting. And the ability to create, and by, taking paintbrushes and dipping them in color, is the imagination. That's the power of making. But then the craft is the middle term in that logical string. It's the thing where you take the power of making, in this case, the power of making stories about a sub-created world, and you actually make that sub-created world in the imagination. And of the people that read your story or listen to your story.
Yeah.
So it's really cool. I love these 10 pages. I think they're core. They're the most important part of this whole essay. And not least of which is as is Tolkien's wont, as a grouchy old professor, he proceeds to, and he's not even old at this point. He's younger than I am. He wrote this when he was younger than I am right now. So
yeah, but you're still pretty grouchy. So
I am. Well, actually, he was about my age. Actually, he is perfect, about my age. So he proceeds in the middle part of this essay to do a takedown of drama, and drama as in theater, as in plays, even throw some shade at Shakespeare a little bit, which was hilarious.
It's like drama is the visual representation of fantasy in that sense. Right. That's what he's looking at. Not a painting, I don't think, so much as would it be like drama? To him, drama was, is it taking a fantasy, but like he didn't like the idea, right? He gives the example of the Ogre and the Mouse, for instance, a little bit later, and we can get to that. But would he have a problem with drama that wasn't fantasy in that sense? Like if it's just a standard, if it's where he mentions Macbeth.
Well, so I before I answer that question, I think what's more important, Jonathan, is, and let me read one sentence here when he begins to talk about it, or actually he's already begun. It's right after the green sun example. And then he says, in human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. In painting, for instance, the visible presence of the fantastic thing is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. And what he's actually, this is funny. My wife and I, as an aside, were recently reviewing the books, because we homeschool our kids, that our kids are going to be reading next year. And there is a particular book, I shall not name, but there's a particular story.
Can you say it in our members extended members podcast?
Sure, I'll talk about it in the members block. But there's a particular story that we found the artwork for our fourth grader to be too much of what Tolkien talks about in his note. So he has it here. He says C note, E at the end. So he has this as his own notes and if you read the note about it, he basically talks about morbid art, which is essentially a dwelling on the unnatural nature, its shape and form of whimsical, fantastical forms, to the point in which you become almost disturbed and obsessed with this. And we rejected this book not because we rejected the story, but because we rejected the art that was in this book as too grotesque and it was not grotesque in the sense that it wasn't well done. It was actually technically very well done, but it was grotesque in the sense that the imaginative, especially the monsters and the evil subject matter, was so powerful that we found it to be inappropriate in the way I think that Tolkien actually talks about in his note E here. But anyway, so he's saying here, silliness or morbidity are the frequent results. It is a misfortune. Now, this is the important sentence here. It is a misfortune that drama, capital D, and art fundamentally distinct from literature should so commonly be considered together with it or as a branch of it. So he is very importantly saying these are two distinct arts. We just talked about the art of fantasy making, which is a branch of literature. He's saying drama, theater, movies are a different art. They are totally different, and it's unfortunate people consider them, they blur them together. A sin, if I might use such language, that we on this podcast have even done when we've interviewed people. Sometimes we've blurred the lines between the literature and the drama, and Tolkien is helping us out by saying, stay in our lane here. Fantasy is really about literature, not about the theater, not about the movies.
And why does he say that is?
Well, that is.
I'm
going to let you guys take a stab at it first, because I have a very passionate speech about this, but I'll save it.
So we're just the preamble to Michael's.
Well, I just don't want to. I'm talking too much. I love this so much
you have many good things to say. So the most interesting thing about this is that I came out of this going, which is his mindset that fantasy, because true subcreation happens in the mind, right? Because it is your own then, right? You are the one subcreating out of what the words of the people have said. Like, they've created the words, but you are creating the desire for that world, right? That's happening inside of you. Whereas when you are seeing a drama, when you are watching a film, it is created for you. And this puts to words actually the way I felt after watching Peter Jackson's films.
Yes.
They created a world for people that would only experience it within one vision, not in the vision that is created by Tolkien. Does that make sense? Or that Tolkien has birthed within, or has grown inside your own head. And so, if I just said, like, we go back to the green sun example, if I said a green sun, what does it look like? Well, some people would see it differently. Some people would see, a sunrise, a sunset. It would be a small sun, a large sun. It would look like the moon. It would be flat. It would be fiery. There's a lot to it. But when it's represented for you on a screen, and all you see is the special effects guys and the director and what they decided, or if it's in a play and it comes on strings in the background as a green sun, right? It's created for you, and it's no longer a sub-creation. It's just a representation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to add to that by going to that note E. Do you guys have that note E in your version as well?
Yeah,
or not?
I do.
Okay. So this is where Tolkien shifts from being Aristotelian to being Platonic, the Platonic forms in a real way that's very interesting. And I'm going to read most of this paragraph here because it's really important, because he is here, because this here, what I'm about to read, shows you what Tolkien thinks the differences between, and what he would even think the differences between the Jackson movies made of his own works and the works themselves. He says, I'm speaking here, of course, of the primary expressions of fantasy and pictorial arts, not of illustrations, nor of the cinematograph, which I take to mean early movies. However good in themselves, illustrations do little good to fairy stories. The radical distinction between all art, including drama, that offers a visible, that's Tolkien's emphasis, presentation, and true literature, is that it imposes one visible form. That's the art that, including drama, that offers a visible presentation. So the painting, even a painting by Ted Naismith, the drama, even the drama by Peter Jackson, present a single visible, it imposes one visible form. The example I give is, I talked to you guys about this earlier, is when I read The Lord of the Rings as a kid before the movies came out, and I read Lembas, I had an idea of what Lembas is about. Now, 95+% of the people in the world that think of Lembas, when they read Lembas or describe Lembas, they will think, if they've seen the movies, of the Peter Jackson representation of Lembas. Those movies have imposed a form upon the minds of the people that watch them. A single visual form. Now no longer is the mind free, or as free, to imagine Lembas in any other form. And so Tolkien goes on, he says, literature works from mind to mind, and is thus more progenitive. It is at once more universal and more poignantly particular. If it speaks of bread or wine or stone or tree, it appeals to the whole of these things, to their ideas. Yet each hearer will give them a peculiar personal embodiment in his imagination. So it's the mind to mind. Should the story say, he ate bread, the dramatic producer or painter can only show a piece of bread according to his taste or fancy. But the hearer of the story will think of bread in general and will picture it in some form of his own. If a story says, quote, he climbed a hill and saw a river in the valley below, close quote, the illustrator may catch or nearly catch his own vision of such a scene. But every hearer of the words will have his own picture and will be made out of all the hills and rivers and dales he has ever seen, but especially out of, caps here, the hill, the river, the valley, which were for him the first embodiment of the word. So Tolkien is really setting aside and saying literature is something higher than the visual representations. Literature is higher than the movies. Literature is higher than the even visual arts, even painting.
Define higher.
It's more pure. It speaks mind to mind. It has more of the ideal concepts in it because so here's what's happening when you have a movie or a Shakespearean play. Actually, there's something even worse happening in a play on stage. A more distant, I should say, not worse.
Before you go into that, I want to talk about. It's more right. It's higher in the sense that there is a creation that is done by both the giver and the receiver, so to speak, by the artist and the viewer or the reader. Whereas in a film, you could say that his creation is a high form of art, but it's one direction only from his mind onto the screen. The rest is an experience and not a subcreation. Meaning all people viewing it are experiencing it, not subcreating it. They're simply along for the ride. They're not engaging their mind in the action of subcreation. When in literature, there is both subcreation on both sides of those aisles, that road.
Exactly. So the product of literature, when we read The Hobbit, the product is not the black letters on the page. The product of literature is the image in our mind that those letters produce. And that's the subcreation. And so the author, through literature, is speaking mind to mind. He's using his mind and crafting words that create in the minds of his readers their own mental world. The best cinematographer doing that, making a movie of The Hobbit, which I would remind our dear viewers has nothing to do with the movies of the Hobbits that came out 12 to 15 years ago. The best cinematographer, all that they can do, the product of their art is a single visual piece.
Yeah.
That's not in the mind. It's only in the mind in that you absorb it with the power, the faculty of the imagination. It's not a creation in your mind. It's just a bunch of images flickering on a screen. So that's their product. That's the product of Leonardo da Vinci is in the Mona Lisa is a single image. It might be a beautiful thing. It might be an arresting thing, but it is not a mind-to-mind subcreation. It is a single visual image, like a photograph, or many flickering images, like a movie. So in this sense, Tolkien, I think, holds literature as a higher art, as a more pure art, as an art closer to the ideals of the mind than the visual arts of any type.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that I think is interesting towards the end of this section where he's talking about, it could be true that you just prefer drama to literature. They're two separate things.
Correct.
And he says, many critics prefer drama. And he says, even from drama, you are apt to misunderstand pure story making and to constrain it to the limitations of stage plays. You are, for instance, likely to prefer characters, even the basest and dullest, to things. And this is my favorite quote in this chapter. It says, very little about trees as trees can be got into a play. So it's just this idea, like the experience of a subcreated world. You are not able to do that in a drama, in a movie, in a play. You are not able to think about the trees as they are trees. Like when you're reading about Fangorn Forest, and you're thinking about trees, like what are trees? You're not able to do that in a movie. The trees are just background that fly by. I thought that was an interesting point that he's making, that for Tolkien, it's very important to talk about the trees.
It always is.
Yeah.
And
There-
read Leaf by Niggle, which we should do at some point. This is
Right.
it's all about the tree.
I mean, this is where, I mean, there is no, in today's drama, there is no narrator to give you the information about trees as there would be in a story either,
That's right.
right? There's no creation of the trees. They're set dressing.
There's very little of trees. Yeah.
There's very little
And I think about this, and then so Tolkien, before you were reading, Dan, he talks about what the problems are with stage plays, and he has this very funny, a number of very funny comments. One of them, which was, men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they do not achieve fantasy. And he also talks about how he saw a stage play where there was an ogre became a mouse. Is that what that was? I'm trying to find the quote now, but basically
here I've got here. I'll read the quote for you.
Okay, yeah, read the quote about his takedown of that.
But yeah, as it was, though done with some ingenuity of lighting, the ogre turning into a mouse, disbelief had not so much to be suspended as hung, drawn, and quartered. That's
fantastic. So going back, he's there playing back to the idea of suspension of disbelief, and this has led me to what it sort of coalesced for me when the second or third time that I read this essay, what I think of the Peter Jackson movies. I like them as movies, but the best that they can achieve when done well is suspension of disbelief. They cannot achieve the secondary world immersion that is the true craft, requires the true craft of fantasy. It requires the true craft of the sub-creator, because their medium is visual images. It is not mind to mind. It is not telling of a world. The actual product that they produce in a movie is a bunch of flickering images. That's it. So they can do so in a way which is compelling, and I would argue Jackson mostly succeeded in that, and that we can suspend our disbelief, but we will never reach the point. I don't think Tolkien would think that we would ever reach the point, and I would agree with him, of actual fantasy in a theater production or a movie production. I don't think it's possible. It was funny because I remember a conversation with my family after reading Lord of the Rings when I was a kid, and it was when I was a teenager. I read it a few times at that point. We were talking about why it was going to be so hard to ever make a Lord of the Rings movie. This was before the Jackson films. And we focused at that point on the technical problem. Like, there's just no way to believably, produce all these fantasy elements that Tolkien has in his story. And we weren't wrong. I don't think we were wrong about that. But all that we were pointing out was a barrier to suspension of disbelief. We were not pointing out a barrier to the actual production of a secondary world and the secondary belief that comes with that. Because I don't think that can happen with a movie or a theater production or anything else other than the literature itself, which speaks mind to mind.
Do you think
rant over?
No. Do you think so? I'm thinking about that more because this, like you said, this is the time for me that it solidified my thoughts about why I disliked the Fellowship of the Ring so much when I saw it in theaters. It's because it ruined the true sub-creation, even inside me at some point, right? You cannot go back to the original vision you had in your head once you see it on film.
Did I ever tell you that's when you first said that to me, Jonathan? I don't know if I ever said this to you. When you first said that, I thought of this essay because I thought, yes, that's what he's talking about.
Said that.
I just never brought it. I don't think I ever brought it up to you because you hadn't. I don't think we'd ever dealt.
Yeah, we haven't talked about this at that point.
Details of the essay.
And I'm trying to get that quote where he says the hand outruns the mind, right? When you're painting, the hand outruns the mind. And the same thing goes, I think the same thing is true in film, in that the hand outruns the mind, meaning maybe it doesn't only outrun the mind, it will also lag behind the mind. It won't run fast enough at times in order to catch up to how the mind sees things. And so these films are still pale imitations of what can be created in a mind-to-mind fantasy world.
Exactly. Yeah. After the quote, which it says, the hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. He says, um, drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Fantasy, even of the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama when it is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted. Fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. So,
Mm-hmm.
so in other words, because by being counterfeited, in other words, being presented, feigned as a thing other than what they are, we recognize them as a thing other than they are. When you go to a play, a Shakespeare play, and you watch Macbeth on stage, the first thing that you know as you're sitting there is you never think that the person on stage is actually Macbeth. You just you can be impressed by it, by their acting quality,
Yeah.
because what you're, if you've read Macbeth, hopefully, you are seeing how closely they adhere to the literature. But nevertheless, they will always be a person walking around on a wooden platform speaking the words of the literature. They will not be Macbeth. And so fantasy is not to be counterfeited. The literature is something higher, superior. And even though theater can be compelling in its own medium, it can be entertaining, it can be even moving and move our emotions. It's not going to ever achieve fantasy.
In the sense that, and he says, right, it's the characters in a drama that we.
Yeah, that's
I'm trying to find the quote here.
That Dan wrote.
Yeah.
Read.
Well, read. He didn't write it. Just
yeah, that Dan read. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and
it's interesting. He uses the word counterfeit multiple times. Like
Yes.
if you're trying to take fantasy and set it to a drama where it's being acted out, everything's visibly represented. He says this is an attempt to counterfeit the magician's wand, even if it's successful, and you are able to portray the secondary world. If you're trying to portray a fantasy world, you're trying to portray a world with a world within a world. And he's saying this is like a world too much, like this is world too far.
Yep.
He says to make such a thing may not be impossible. So I think we're at the point like that when he was writing this in his day, it would have been impossible, I think. But now we have CGI and computer graphics that can make a dragon fly through the sky. But I think even then he'd say that's still counterfeit. It's a world within a world, and you're not capturing what the literature can capture.
Right, because at its heart, like I read from his note E, at its heart, the art is a different art. The art of the theater is a different art from the art of literature. And that's because their object and their production are different things. One produces, the theater produces, even if it's the moving picture theater, produces a visual set of images. And literature produces a mental world set of images. Yes, they are images, but they are in a person's mind. They are more particular to them. They are deeper and touch closer to the ideals and the universals of truth than the physical picture will ever do, even though the physical picture can be an impressive thing.
I think of this. This is my favorite line, my favorite two sentences from The Lord of the Rings. And how do you portray this on screen? Because when I read this the first time, it subcreated a feeling, a vision inside of me that it cannot be replicated on screen or on stage or in any way. Like no matter how many special effects you have, you cannot create this kind of a sense of feeling that is being communicated from the author to the reader. So let me read this.
All right, lay it on us.
This is Frodo in the halls of the Hall of Fire in Rivendell.
I was hoping we were going to bring up the Hall of Fire.
Yeah. Cool. So here he says, almost it seemed, Tolkien writes all this. There's no quotes here. Almost it seemed that the words took shape and visions of far lands and bright things that he had never yet imagined opened out before him. And the firelit hall became like a golden mist above seas of foam that sighed upon the margins of the world. Then the enchantment became more and more dreamlike until he felt that an endless river of swelling gold and silver was flowing over him, too multitudinous for its pattern to be comprehended. It became part of the throbbing air around him, and it drenched him and drowned him. Swiftly, he sank under its shining weight into a deep realm of sleep. And it has this this short paragraph has all those items that we talked about with the green sun. We talk about golden mist, right, above seas of foam that sighed upon the margins of the world. All those things don't really, for those descriptions, you don't. Mist does not sigh, really. There are no margins of the world. We talk about swelling gold and silver was flowing over him, right? And the air was throbbing around. How do you communicate these things with special effects? You can't. But when Tolkien wrote that and I read that, I had this feeling of being there with him. I had not the feeling. I
Exactly.
had I had created that world around myself when I read it.
Right.
And seeing it on film diminishes it so much for
Right.
me.
It's a kind of almost transcendent experience. It's an
Yeah.
inner experience. That's the best way I can put it.
Yeah.
It's an inner experience that transcends what a film, no matter how well done, can do. In fact, the only thing a film, even a well done film, can do is limit that expression, because it has to show
Good point.
particular things.
Yeah.
And despite the special effects abilities of Peter Jackson's team, which were prodigious, they just lost. They didn't even have this
scene wasn't even
this scene at all. It was, I would say, beyond their ability. They couldn't even touch it, because you can't produce it without doing it badly, like an LSD dream of some kind. So,
or like Thorin with his gold sickness in The Hobbit. I don't know if you remember that, and he's like being swallowed by gold, and it becomes
it becomes trite. It's not real, in a very bad way of being not real. So I love it. So what you have just pointed to, this is why you're a genius, Jonathan. So you've just provided us with the perfect segue, because what you just read was in fact the Faërian Drama. So Tolkien in the Silmarillion has a Faërian Drama. He actually has two, but one of them is more remote, so I'm going to only read one. And then in Lord of the Rings, he has a Faërian Drama. And the Faërian Drama is this interesting side note he talks about on fairy stories in this particular section. And it's much misunderstood. There are people bring it up in college literature courses and are confused by it, and whether Tolkien's saying there's actually really elves or not. And I'll read the first sentence or two so you understand why the confusion occurs. But the Faërian Drama, I'm gonna read those sentences, and I'm gonna give you what I think is the encapsulation in a single idea, so that it doesn't become too confusing. Now, Faërian Drama, those plays which, according to abundant record, the elves have often presented to men, can produce fantasy with a realism and immediacy beyond the compass of any human mechanism. As a result, their usual effect upon a man is to go beyond secondary belief. If you are present at a Faërian Drama, you yourself are, or think that you are, bodily inside its secondary world. The experience may be very similar to dreaming, and it has, it would seem, sometimes by men, been confounded with it. But in a Faërian Drama, you are in a dream that some other mind is weaving, and the knowledge of that alarming fact may slip from your grasp. To experience directly a secondary world, the potion is too strong, and you give to it primary belief, however marvelous the events. So that is what you just read about in the Hall of Fire in Rivendell. Frodo is having a Faërian Drama being presented to him by the elves who are singing. And then there's another passage also by an elf in the Silmarillion, and I'm going to read that. It's from Finrod Felagund, who's one of my favorite elves, probably my second favorite elf of the Silmarillion. Now men awoke, and this is Felagund came upon the men of Beor, and he took up a rude harp which Beor laid aside, and he played music upon it, such as the ears of men had not heard, for they had as yet no teachers in the art, save only the dark elves in the wildlands. Now men awoke and listened to Felagund as he harped and sang, and each thought that he was in some fair dream, until he saw that his fellows were awake also beside him. But they did not speak or stir while Felagund still played, because the beauty of the music and the wonder of the song. Wisdom was in the words of the elven king, and the hearts grew wiser that hearkened to him. For the things of which he sang, of the making of Arda and the bliss of Aman beyond the shadows of the sea, came as clear visions before their eyes, and his elvish speech was interpreted in each mind according to its measure. So I'm going to read that last part again. His elvish speech was interpreted in each mind according to its measure. Felagund is singing in Elvish, and such is the power of his Faërian Drama that he's presenting the creation of the world to these minds of these men. that his Elvish, a language they don't understand, because it's a Noldorin Elvish, Quenya, it is transforming in their mind and forming the images. So this is a very similar passage to what's happening to Frodo in the Hall of Fire. This is the Faërian drama. This is what happens when elves take fantasy to its ultimate form, Super Saiyan form. So fantasy taken to Super Saiyan levels is the Elvish Faërian drama, or capital E enchantment, as Tolkien says. So this is now, does Tolkien think there's actually such a thing?
That's a dead silence there. It's not good in podcast, guys.
To the Elvish
Yes.
craft, enchantment, fantasy aspires, and when it is successful, of all forms of human art, most nearly approaches. So when fantasy is successful, it approaches this Elvish enchantment, which kind of presumes that Tolkien thinks there is something to approach, which means he thinks that it's a real thing.
It's almost like a platonic ideal.
Yeah, I think it is. But I think it's something interesting, because I do think that Tolkien is making an allusion here to a thing that is more real than the thing in the world that we have.
Right.
Again, as you say, Dan, very platonic, but a more real thing in its wondrousness in this secondary world that it presents. And so wondrous that when the elves do it, when the actual enchantment is there, then people mistake the story for reality. They think that the secondary world being sung about or told is the primary world. Hence Frodo in the Hall of Fire, hence Beor's men in front of Felagund. And I'll bring up two more examples from our own culture of stories in which there is a Faërian drama that is told. Of course, in these stories, it's an angelic being in each story that's telling the drama, the Faërian drama. And there is some similarity between angels and elves. The first one is Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol, when Ebenezer Scrooge is presented with an angelic being of some kind, with the potential Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future. And he interacts in those world. Ebenezer walks around and does things and interacts with people, even though he's actually brought into that world. A story is told to him of the past, the present, and the future in Christmas, and he is brought into that world. He mistakes that world for the primary world. And then also, It's a Wonderful Life. George Bailey is presented with the same kind of Faërian drama by his angel about what the world would be like without George Bailey, and it's so real. It becomes his reality. Like the story that is being told is so powerful that his mind is drawn in, and he mistakes it for the primary reality. So there's this idea of a Faërian drama, I say, is actually an idea, though most people haven't heard of it. It does have threads throughout our storytelling traditions in the West.
So your question was, does it exist?
Yes.
I would say Tolkien would say no, because it is aspirational.
Okay.
Right?
So you say no, it doesn't exist in the primary world, is what you mean by that.
Yes, that's what I mean by that, because he says it, to the elvish craft, enchantment, fantasy aspires. And when fantasy is successful, of all forms of human art, most nearly approaches. So it's approaching it, but it can't reach it.
In its success, it can only approach it.
Yes, it is a glimpse of true enchantment, but not an actual experience of enchantment. That can only be done outside of our primary world, I would say.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that the goal of a whole subgenre of literature is to aspire to something like this.
Yeah,
according to Tolkien. So if you were to ask what the goal of a crime drama is, what's over a mystery, let's take another subgenre popular in Tolkien's time, Agatha Christie's, building on the Arthur Conan Doyle and the whole tradition that's now become a glut of the murder mystery.
Mhm.
What's the goal of that murder mystery in literature? I would say it's to clearly represent to the mind the tangle of human motivations, the darker human motivations, and present a kind of mental puzzle, which the reader or watcher, in the case of cinematic versions, is invited to try to untangle in their minds, to figure out who done it.
Right.
Like that's the point, is to, and why. You know, who did the great evil and why.
It's just a big, long word problem. And
yeah, that's right. It's a mental puzzle. It's a mental word problem. That's right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the point of the murder mystery. Entertaining can be if it's done well.
Sure.
But the goal of fantasy is something much more transcendent.
I think
than and sadly, fantasy is considered a more childish genre of literature than the murder mystery, even.
That's because we have Terry Brooks and George R.R. Martin and all those guys to thank for giving it the word fantasy and taking away the meaning that Tolkien originally gave it. Was this the first time that fantasy was used? I mean, I have no idea. You probably don't either. I wonder if it was the first time when the word fantasy was used to describe this kind of subcreation of a non-primary world that was experiential. And I wonder if that was given.
It's near the beginning anyway. And what I find fascinating is the tangle of fantasy with science fiction that has happened. They're now, like, you go to a library, not that anyone goes to libraries anymore, but if you were to go to this old weird place called the library, you would find that the fantasy novels and the science fiction novels usually reside in the same section of the library.
Well, even bookstores used to, when we had bookstores, they stick, I don't know, they stick Tolkien right next to Frank Herbert. And
yes, exactly right.
Asimov next to
Brooks.
It's
exactly wrong, but you are exactly correct.
Yes.
In your recounting. I think that's...
Yeah. Did they used to? Maybe. Yeah, I think so. I think fantasy and science fiction. Thinking back to my B. Dalton bookseller times. You guys remember that place in malls in the 90s?
I remember B. Dalton's. Yes.
Yeah. Walden Books.
I hung out at B. Dalton's quite a bit.
But yeah, they separated those things there quite a bit.
Yeah. Now, one could make a case that what we now call science fiction in its best form is a kind of what Tolkien would call fantasy.
Yeah.
In its best form, that it can be sub-creative. So perhaps not inappropriate to put them together, maybe inappropriate to separate them in the first place. That's the problem, like calling it science fiction versus fantasy. That's the problem. Fantasy would be all of them. So now we're on to our the final stage of this 10 pages, which is what Tolkien thinks about this sub-creative art of fantasy in general. And to emphasize what Dan brought up earlier today, but Tolkien references this other guy he wrote. To many, fantasy, this sub-creative art which plays strange tricks with the world and all that is in it, combining nouns and redistributing adjectives, has seemed suspect, if not illegitimate. To some, it has seemed at least a childish folly, a thing only for people or for persons in their youth. As for its legitimacy, I will say no more than to quote a brief passage from a letter I once wrote to a man who described myth and fairy story as quote unquote lies, though to do him justice, he was kind enough and confused enough to call fairy story making quote breathing a lie through silver, close quote. And then Tolkien gives you his answer, and his answer, as those of us, is not inappropriate, as those of us have read the Silmarillion. If you've been with us through the Silmarillion, his answer is a poem, because this is what Tolkien does. It's poems and songs.
Which he initially disliked too, as we found out last week.
That's right. But this leads to his final sentence. Do you want to read the poem, Dan? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah. Dear sir, I said, although now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white, to many hues and endlessly combined, in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled, with elves and goblins though we dared to build, gods in their houses out of dark and light, and sowed the seed of dragons, 'twas our right. Used or misused, that right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we are made.
And that leads to that conclusion, which I love that poem. It's a great little poem.
Yeah.
And this is his final stance on fantasy.
I like how Tolkien gets hate mail, and he's like, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to write this guy a poem.
That's right.
Maybe the world would be a better place if more of us responded to hate mail that way. So fantasy, he says, is a natural human activity. And then later on he says, fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made. And not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker, capital M. So this is the root of what fantasy is there for. We make in this way, we make imaginatively, we make sub-creatively, we create new worlds in our head, and it is our right because we were made. We imitate the maker in doing so. And even though some people do so badly, my favorite line from this chapter is in Latin, of course, abusus non tollit usum, or abuse does not remove use. So just because someone abuses something or misuses it doesn't mean the thing does not have a right use and ought not to be practiced. So just because there's the rings of power doesn't mean
you got it in, Michael. Good job. Good.
I did it. I brought it in. Just because there's a rings of power doesn't mean that people shouldn't, in fact, keep trying to create within Tolkien's world. I wholly support the idea of well-made movies. They will never achieve the level of fantasy. They will never be literature. They will never have that mind-to-mind connection and creation that literature does. But they are an entertaining and fun art, and they are their own art, and they should be pursued in that spirit and not abused. So,
and this chapter also for me focuses the reason why we don't, the question we always ask, the last question we ask whenever we do our Tolkien Inquisition and we interview somebody, the last question we always ask them in the members block is, what do we need to do in order to get people to write better stories instead of having all these retreads, like imaginative, real, true, sub-creative stories, instead of retreads, remakes, recreation, everything's redone, right? We're like, I think I just read that they're going to make a Tangled now, and the Disney, right? They're even remaking their own stuff. They're taking an original story that they've been doing that for years. Fairy tale, making it a cartoon, taking their poor imitation and making it a live action. So it focuses it because people aren't experiencing true sub-creation anymore because they're not reading, and what they're reading is simply masked writing, or writing that is masked in social constructs that people wish to force upon you, right? That's what English literature generally is, right? You don't read great stories. I mean, you have Shakespeare classes, which is great, and there's something to be said for that, even for reading it, even so more than viewing it. But you don't have, like, there aren't really fiction classes anymore. If it is, it's fiction based around certain social ideals, social justice, right? Social justice fiction, right? You get these weird classes. You do not have. You'll have Hemingway, you'll have a few of those guys, but you won't have this kind of sub-creative fiction as an actual practice in any secondary school or college or university.
Yeah. You'll still find fiction classes, but what you'll find in the fiction classes, if you attend them, is a host, as you were saying, just I'll say it in a different way. You'll find a host of subjective nonsense that's based upon the professors and maybe the people in the class's own experience of what they like or feel about certain things. What you don't have, what a fiction class ought to start with is the great fiction first. First, you should read the great fiction in a fiction class, and then you should try to figure out how the author did what they did and distill it down to elements. Now, they will sometimes say that they're doing that in these fiction works, but really it boils down to the feels, and that's not enough to have an art. To have an art, you need more than the feels, and this is and this is what
that kind
go
that
ahead.
kind of fiction was the precursor to what we see in TV and films now. Is that the fiction was used to take a stance, and if you don't take a stance on something that is of the primal world that we live in, then it's unimportant, and that's what professors in English literature taught. And so now those same people who taught the students that have come up and are running these shows, if your show doesn't take a stance, a social stance of some sort, then it's unimportant, right? Having sheer subcreation isn't good enough. It has to make a difference for what you believe.
So, and that's true. And then there's a parallel point, different but parallel, which is we hear so much, and we heard it up to the Rings of Power. We hear it in so many other fantasy pieces of visual arts that come out, which is that the directors think that you have to be able to see the person that's like you in order to relate to that person. Yeah. So this is the excuse given for diversification of characters in, for example, let's I know this is a Tolkien podcast, but even in things like The Witcher, for example, which is a Polish narrative tale. And Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which is a Northern European narrative tale. But the idea is, if we don't include people of all different races, then somehow you won't be able to see. That is, in fact, in a complete inversion of what Tolkien has just told us you're supposed to be doing with subcreation. You're not supposed to go, when you go to subcreate, and go, I'm going to create a world. Let me go into it. And let's see how much like the actual world that I live in I can make it like. I can just keep referring back to the point where you've destroyed what he says is the primary point of the art. The primary, if we remind ourselves, the primary point of the art of fantasy is the inner consistency of reality. And once your village of 60 people in the middle of the mountains of what's now going to become Mordor looks like your cosmopolitan bar scene in New York City, then you've lost that inner consistency of reality. Because of your great desire to make people have the feels of what they had already. Yeah. You are, in fact, supposed to be giving them a story where they are not having the feels about what they are familiar with. You're supposed to be putting them in a new world. And if you can't do that, and you keep referencing the old world continuously and illogically, then you're going to ruin your even what is even a piece of drama, which is separate from literature. You're even going to ruin your drama about that world.
Well, it's like my 8-year-old daughter is reading Charlotte's Web for the first time, and she picked it up and read it and slammed it down and said, "How can I identify with this? It's a pig and a spider."
Oh no!
No, I'm joking. She didn't say that, but that's the same idea. Why would I enjoy this? I can't identify with this pig and spider. It's so that's not me. That's not you enjoy it because it's.
I have some thoughts about Charlotte's Web. I have some hilarious reactions from my various children about reading Charlotte's Web for the first time. We should compare notes in our members section.
Oh, okay. She hasn't finished it yet, but she's read most of it in 2 days. She actually really likes it, and so she's not the reader, and we're trying to get her to do more. And homeschooling allows us to pick better things than what. That's exactly right.
That's exactly right.
We're working towards things. So anyway, all right. Wow, this 10 pages, but a long episode because
everyone.
It was the meatiest. It was good. Anything else left to say, guys?
Just before we move on, I just thought that last line that this section ends on, that's why I'm so grateful that we're reading through Tolkien's writings outside of Lord of the Rings. You kind of get a picture of the man, and the man is writing here on fairy stories like what he thought he was doing when he was writing Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit.
Yeah.
He saw himself as subcreating because he is made in the image of the creator. And I always crack up when I read things online where they try to divorce Tolkien's religious faith from what he created. Like, oh, no, it's not It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with Christianity or Christ. But then Tolkien saw himself while he's writing Lord of the Rings. I am sub-creating because I'm created.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that is such a massively important point that anybody who wants to understand Tolkien needs to understand that.
I could not agree more, Dan. I do think, interestingly, and I'll start our members section with filling this out, but I do think, as a teaser, that Tolkien set himself up for failure in that regard, actually, because of a certain element that goes on that he just described in this section, like what fantasy is. So anyway, I think he is dealing, or maybe another way to put it is, his work is dealing with an inherent weakness of fantasy, or difficulty or disadvantage. I'll call it what Tolkien calls it, a disadvantage that fantasy has. Because of what its nature is, the nature of the literature. So anyway, we can go into that once we get rid of all the freeloaders, who we love. We love you, freeloaders. You're wonderful people, but you are freeloaders. So Jonathan, take it away.
Give us money.
I don't know if I'm going to put this in the regular podcast, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, just because this thought crossed my mind, and it might be important to keep here. I don't know. We'll find out. Maybe I'll edit this out. I don't know. Who knows? So
he won't edit it out.
The whole idea of no, probably not. It's too much work. The idea of enchantment, right, where you are experiencing something completely different, and how, as sub creators, we are made in the image of a maker, and how the eucatastrophe of Christ is the true myth, right? All this sort of stuff, all this enchantment fantasy points to the truth of God's invasion of this world, and God's coming to the world, right? So there's this. Is being born again, is baptism, is that an enchantment of sorts? Is because your whole world changes, right? Your whole, like, at that point, that is where essentially you should, like, the way that the primary world is affecting you is no longer the same. The way that you live your life is no longer the same. You are living in at least in my mind, and the way that I think about it, is like you're living in a different perception of reality than you were before.
Yeah, okay, since you brought it up, I will say, I think that it is not. I think baptism is better, and I think Tolkien would agree. Baptism as a sacrament is a grace that effects what it signifies. So Tolkien points out that in the enchantment, in a Faërian drama, you mistake the real world for the secondary world. The secondary world is being presented to you in such an overwhelming fashion.
Yeah.
But in baptism, the secondary world being presented to you infuses the real world, and it actually changes you. So right, so it's something more than enchantment.
Yes, right, and that's why I'm saying, like, but it's in the same way that enchantment can be an echo of real truth, of real life, of what. Right, of what the absolute reality of this existence is. Baptism, born again, being in the presence of God, is even more so than that. I would agree with that. It's anyway. I'll just throw that in there at the end. It's this little thing to.
We're all living in the secondary world, and the primary world is reaching to us.
That's right. All right. Okay. All right. Freeloaders.
Bye-bye.
On the dirty masses of I'm joking. We're going to move on. Yes. If you do want to get the extended podcast, we're going to talk more about Peter Jackson's film Subcreation, whether or not these films actually are like destroying subcreation in a way, in more depth. We're going to get into that in a few questions that we have from other folks too. So I hope you'll see us there. Go to theonering.com/member. See you on the other side.
Bye-bye.